Cocaine and consequences. A Honduran president's trial in New York. The prosecution of Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, in a federal district court on charges of conspiracy to import narcotics has gripped the tiny Central American country and its expatriates, drawing a cross-section of the 40,000 Hondurans who live in New York City, as well as others from out of state and even Honduras itself. And one person from Honduras says he sent our country to hell. And what do you think the New York Times leaves out? Maybe the fact that he was brought to power by a U.S. coup in 2009 that ultimately allowed him to come to power, and he was supported by the U.S. throughout his reign of terror. Hondurans see American courts, continuing New York Times, as a venue for something unavailable back home, a fair trial and a measure of justice. First of all, I think it's hilarious to say the U.S. brings a fair trial and justice, considering, for one example, just because I'll say this just because it's the same district in New York, Stephen Donziger, well-known lawyer, won a massive case against Chevron, and for that, they prosecuted him in New York City, put him on house arrest for winning a case against Chevron for killing indigenous people in Ecuador with their pollution that they intentionally polluted. It was not accidental, intentional pollution. But okay, so that's the New York Times, but I want to bring you the full story of what's going on here, what the New York Times leaves out. And it's a lot. The U.S. turns on, this is from liberationnews.org, the U.S. turns on its puppet dictator, extradited him from Honduras to the United States to face charges. But this was after he was out of power. So he was no longer useful to them. In a press release, Secretary of State Antony Blinken stated that Hernandez engaged in significant corruption while committing or facilitating acts of corruption and narco-trafficking and using the proceeds of illicit activity to facilitate political campaigns. What this statement leaves out is Washington's direct culpability in backing Hernandez's regime. This was a U.S.-backed government that we're now prosecuting for corruption because he's out of power. Trump's Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf referred to the Hernandez government back during the Trump administration as a valued and proven partner to the United States. Hernandez took office in 2014. The Pentagon had provided the country over $50 million of aid. And most importantly, the U.S. installed the right-wing National Party regime from which Hernandez emerged, backing the overthrow of democratically elected progressive president Manuel Zelaya in 2009 in a military coup. So a U.S.-backed military coup went down in 2009, getting rid of Zelaya this is under Obama, and the U.S. supported it all. I'm going to go to this other article by Gray Zone, reposted by popularresistance.org. It says, the U.S. is taking the former president to trial over allegations he converted the Honduran state into a de facto drug cartel. Here's a quote from the Southern District, filed by the Southern District of New York. Juan Orlando effectively operated Honduras in a narco-state, acquiring political power through narcotics-fueled bribes and maintaining it by allowing the free flow of drugs through Honduras. The U.S. DEA officials confirmed Hernandez's direct involvement in narco trafficking within days of his 2014 inauguration. So the DEA knew this guy was a narco trafficker before, on the day of his election. And yet they continued to collaborate with the administration, keeping it flush with cash and protected from legal scrutiny. In private, Hernandez vowed to stuff the drugs right up the noses of the gringos, while in public, he was heartily embraced by the Obama administration officials, including the current U.S. President Joe Biden. Despite possessing intimate knowledge of Hernandez's criminal activities, officials in the Obama White House worked tirelessly to keep his presidency afloat. While drug war refugees and narcotics from the country flooded American streets, Washington transferred over $1 billion into Honduras's state coffers. So the U.S. was funding and facilitating this narco state as it oppressed its people, as it destroyed the economics, gave the U.S. and other imperial arms access to its resources. Hernandez's ascent to power came 5 years after Honduran military forces removed the country's democratically elected president Zelaya in a U.S.-backed coup. Despite a constitutional one-term limit on Honduran presidency, Washington would go on to provide key political support for Hernandez's subsequent re-election bid. So constitutionally, he was only allowed to be president for one term, and he did it multiple times. It succeeded. The vote succeeded in 2017, even though the vote was so crooked, even Western corporate media eventually demanded a do-over. The Honduran national nightmare began early morning in 2009. So this is the U.S.-backed coup back in 2009 when the popular President Zelaya was toppled. January 28, 2009, roughly 100 masked Honduran soldiers stormed the residence of Manuel Zelaya and roused him from sleep. The Special Forces unit marched him into the street at gunpoint, locked him into a vehicle, ultimately onto a plane destined for a U.S.-run military base in the south of the capital. Oh, a U.S.-run base was happy to receive him. From there, soldiers shipped him off to neighboring Costa Rica, where he arrived on a deserted tarmac before sunup, still in his pajamas. So this is yet again, the U.S. has done this multiple times, where we facilitate a coup by making sure the military of that country is ready to create the coup. Then when it actually happens, we jump in and help fly the president to some other foreign country so that they basically can be called MIA, and the people of their actual country are kind of standing there with their dicks in their hands and their vaginas in their hands going, what do we do? And so the coup is facilitated because the president has literally been flown away. And we did it also with Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti. He was flown to Africa on a U.S. military flight, grabbed up, flown to Africa while still president, allowing for the coup to take place. As Zelaya denounced the morning's event as a coup before cameras in San Jose, his political foes in Tegucigalpa mobilized to dismantle his government. Within hours, the National Congress entered a supposed resignation letter from Zelaya, which he says was forged, into the official record, voted to remove him from office, and installed President of the legislature, Roberto Micheletti, as interim president. Meanwhile, a U.S. general offered 2 Honduran colonels involved in the coup behind-the-scenes assistance in Washington. You always wonder, whenever you hear about these coups, and I've covered so many of them, whenever you hear about them, you always wonder, what was the thing, first of all, that pushed America to want a coup immediately? What was going on where they were like, okay, it's time for a coup. We've tried to bribe them. We've tried other things. It's just, we got to just grab them and fly them away. Well, I always wonder, what was the thing that happened? But in the case of what's going on in New York right now, where Hernandez is being prosecuted, I always wonder, why isn't the U.S. supporting their puppet? So with the first question, what happened to push the U.S. into coupping Honduras? Well, besides having a very popular left-wing president, Zelaya, that's part of it. But perhaps even more than that, the coup on Zelaya happened just hours before Hondurans were slated to vote in a referendum on whether to convene a national constituent assembly and write a new constitution. The Zelaya-led initiative may have allowed Honduras to follow the example of Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, 3 nations that established modern constitutions, dramatically expanding economic and social rights while asserting sovereign control of domestic resources near the turn of the century. So basically, Honduras was on the cusp of following Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador in creating constitutions that were far more favorable to the people, and the people of that country, and especially the non-rich people, would have had a big leg up in having a functioning society for them. And the U.S. cannot have that. And so it was past the time where they try and lightly coup someone, and it was into the emergency, we're going to grab him and fly him away coup stylings, if you will. Micheletti's interim government proceeded to not only cancel the June 28th referendum, but institute a 45-day state of emergency, suspended constitutional protections for all Hondurans. For many Hondurans, however, the assault on their freedom extended throughout the entirety of the ensuing coup regime, which formally lasted until 2022. The homicide rate in Honduras skyrocketed during the coup's years. At the same time, the number of Hondurans living in extreme poverty rose by 10%, which is always the case. When the U.S. coups a socialist or leftist leader and puts in a right-wing, often dictator, it always ends up the same. it always ends up with murder skyrocketing, extreme poverty skyrocketing, and all the normal protections of a good functioning society being gutted, and the resources being extracted or given to corporations, multinationals. These factors directly contributed to a migration crisis at the U.S. southern border. Boy, have you heard anything about immigrants at the southern border? Did the U.S. cause any of that? No. It's just these surly Latin Americans. They always want to come here. Yeah, maybe because we destroy their fucking countries. These factors directly contribute to the migration culture, with Border Patrol agents reporting an astonishing 1,272% increase in their apprehension of Honduran children between 2009 and 2014. Basically, the U.S. goes down there, facilitates a coup, destroys the country, and as a result, thousands, or maybe, I don't know if it's millions, but thousands of Hondurans head towards the United States. Honduras' vehemently pro-Washington National Party maintained a stranglehold on local politics, first through a wealthy land developer named Pepe Lobo Sosa, then via attorney-turned-drug boss Juan Orlando Hernandez. Soon enough, Honduras rapidly deteriorated into a hellish narco-state. As the U.S. government indictment against the former president alleged, the rampant drug trafficking that occurred under Juan Orlando's support and with the help of high-ranking officials resulted in a lawlessness in Honduras and directly contributed to Honduras' rampant violent crime, corruption, and poverty. Protesters on Election Day were met with beatings and disappearances, and while governments across the region rejected the vote, Washington did everything in its power to legitimize the corrupt vote. Thomas Shannon, the State Department's top official working on Honduras, said Honduran voters have taken back their democracy, quote unquote. Shannon wrote in an email to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on the day of the vote, Honduran voters, on this corrupt vote, Honduran voters have taken back their democracy. He said, quote, we should congratulate the Honduran people. Secretary of State Clinton would offer her own congratulations to Lobo days later. Just over a decade on, however, U.S. prosecutors acknowledged that drug traffickers not only funded Lobo's presidential run, but physically seized polling stations during the 2009 election. At the time, Hernandez was running for a legislative seat in the National Congress. Ultimately, U.S. prosecutors alleged that Lobo and Hernandez worked together on all of this. Lobo is banned from traveling to the U.S. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, accusing the former president of accepting bribes from narco-trafficking organization in exchange for political favors. Lobo's son is serving 24 years in a U.S. federal prison for drug trafficking. His wife serving 14 years in jail, being found guilty of spending $500,000 public funds. Lobo himself was exposed as creating Panama-based shell companies, two of which were launched during his presidency. Yet Pepe Lobo's corruption is a mere drop in the bucket compared to that of Juan Orlando Hernandez. Hernandez consolidated the Honduran state as a massive drug trafficking operation. So again, all of this done with U.S. high-fiving all along. But then Hernandez is not in power anymore. The thing is, like, there's different levels to the U.S. ruling elite, right? And you have the top level, like the Bidens and the Blinkens and stuff like that, and they will definitely protect their puppet when he's in power. When he's out of power, they're not going to step in and save him. They know what he was. Like, there's no reason. He was a puppet that they don't need anymore. There's no reason why they should protect him anymore. And that's what the U.S. does when they're done with a puppet. They move on. They don't keep protecting their puppets. They're just like, whatever. And plus, they probably figure that considering how clearly Juan Orlando Hernandez was corrupt, the U.S. ruling elite probably says, why? It makes us look bad to keep protecting him. Whereas he was useful, and we don't mind looking bad. We don't mind, it's a little not so good to be in bed with this guy. We don't mind that when he's useful to us. When he's no longer useful to us, it's better for the U.S. empire to just throw him to the wolves and move on. So the U.S. created this hellscape in Honduras and then, acts like they have nothing to do with it. And now they're prosecuting their puppet that they supported his entire reign of terror. Nowadays that Hernandez is out of office and no longer of any use to the United States, it has turned on its former puppet. This, the managers of U.S. imperial foreign policy hope, will help cover up the embarrassing relationship they maintained for so many years with a drug trafficking kingpin. Hernandez left office after losing in a landslide last November to current president Castro. Castro is a member of the left-wing Libre Party, formed by a coalition of people's organizations opposed to the 2009 coup. The U.S. knows that their coups will often not last forever, but they just support them as long as they can. And then sometimes they lose the coup, but, they lose grasp of it. But once that puppet's out of power, useless. Let them die. Look at Gaddafi. Gaddafi chopped in half in the streets of Libya. Gaddafi used to be their man, right? I don't know if you know that. Gaddafi used to be the guy they would tour around with in the early 2000s and say, hey, he's our fella. He's our guy. But once he wasn't anymore, once he was talking about creating a gold-backed currency across Africa, hurting the petrodollar, then bayoneted in the streets. Saddam Hussein used to be our guy. There's footage of him shaking hands with Donald Rumsfeld, right? Great friends. Then they realized no longer important.